Next reading is Corporate Governance, CFA Level 1, 2020 and 2021 with FTC Global. First question, with one-tier board structure. Before we study the board structure, let me just first tell you that there are two types of structures of the boards. One tier and two tier. In one tier, there is one board of directors divided into executive directors and non-executive directors. Non-executive directors, they do not have any operational role. They serve in different committees, so they serve as an independent arm of the board. In two-tier structure, the board is split into two parts. First one is called the supervisory board, and second one is called the management board. Supervisory board keeps an eye on the management board. Right. So with one tier board structure, senior managers determine corporate strategy. As we can see in one tier board structure, executive and non-executive directors, mean the senior managers and the independent directors. They serve on the one tier board and they are jointly responsible for determining the corporate strategy. So not just senior managers alone, not just independent directors alone. Both executive and non-executive can serve on the board of directors. So that makes C to be the correct option, and C it is. A conflict of interest between corporate stakeholders is least likely to be mitigated by what? Covenants in debt indentures. Covenants are restrictive clauses in the debt bond indenture that minimize the conflict between the creditors, those who have purchased the bonds in your company, and the management. So it is one of the tools that will reduce the conflict of interest. It's a valid point. It's a valid point. We are looking for a situation, a conflict of interest between corporate stakeholders least likely to be mitigated by. Mitigated means reduce. So covenants and debt indentures, it will reduce the conflict. Including stock options as a part of managers' compensation. Managers, they have their own interest to serve. Shareholders, they have their own interest. There's a conflict. When managers are given stock options, which can be converted into shares in the future, it will result in goal congruence. Management will think in the same way as the shareholders do. So issuing stock options warrants to the managers, senior managers like Vikram Pandit in Citigroup of Corporation, Elon Musk in Tesla Motors, these senior managers have been issued stock options worth millions of dollars so as to bring their interest in alignment with the interest of the stakeholders and shareholders. So this is one of the tools through which we can mitigate the risk of conflict of interest. But issuing stock dividends, it is simply reclassification of equity. Equity is transferred from retained earning into common stock, debiting the retained earning, crediting the common stock. In case of small stock dividend, large stocks dividend, simply reclassification of equity. So this is least likely to mitigate any conflict of interest. So that makes C to be the correct option. C it is. A company's director's duty of loyalty is most accurately described as requiring a director to do what? To act in the interest of the company and its stakeholders. This is the exact description of the duty of loyalty. The directors will act in the interest of the company and its shareholders. A is the correct option. Why not B? Perform his or her duties in good faith with due diligence. This is the director's duty of care. Duty of care. We are looking for duty of loyalty. That is A. B is duty of care. C. Carry out the duties assigned by managers of the companies. Amazing. So you think managers assign duties to the directors? Totally other way around. Managers do not dictate. They don't boss around. They don't boss the directors around. Wrong, incorrect statement. So clearly A is the right answer. Next, a relationship between a company shareholder and its senior managers is best described as what? Those who have read the corporate governance theory, I'm sure you know, shareholders are the principals because they are the owners They hold the shares in the company, and they have appointed some people to the board of directors who will serve on the board on their behalf. So shareholders are the principals, agents work on behalf of the shareholders. It's an agency relationship. It's an agency relationship. So the relationship between a company's shareholders and its managers, senior managers, is best described as not principal relationship, it's an agency relationship where shareholders are the principals and senior managers are the agents. Senior managers act as agents. In fact, they are hired to act in the interest of the shareholders. That's why they are the agents serving for the principals. That makes B to be the correct option, and B it is. Next, in the absence of any ESG related constraint, let us first discuss what is ESG. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance related constraint. There is a growing concern, there is growing evidence that suggests that ESG factors, environment, social, and governance factors, when integrated into investment analysis and portfolio construction, it may offer investors potential long-term performance advantages. Not just the profitability alone, we have to be careful about environment, social implications of our investments, as well as governance. So combining these all will offer investors potential long-term performance advantages. Right. So in the absence of any ESG related constraint specified in any investment policy, there is no ESG related constraint, no restriction on the investment manager or in the investment policy statement. No such restriction. A portfolio manager is most likely to violate fiduciary duty. What is fiduciary duty? Fiduciary duty is the duty of trust and confidence, a duty that a doctor performs for its patients, for his patient, a teacher performs for his students, a lawyer performs for his clients. Fiduciary, the relationship of mutual trust and confidence. The duty performed under it is called fiduciary duty. So a portfolio manager who is under the fiduciary duty is most likely to violate a fiduciary duty by using ESG factors to do what? Exclude investments with the negative ESG characteristics from the investor's portfolio. Since there is no ESG related constraints, why should he be removing some investments that have negative ESG characteristics? There is no constraint on him. Since there is no such constraint, if he does exclude such investments, he is violating fiduciary duty, because by doing so, he might be reducing the expected returns. Because there is no constraint, absence of any ESG related, no constraint, maafi restriction. Do whatever you want. So when there is no restriction and you exclude certain investments from the portfolio because they have negative ESG constraint, you are violating the fiduciary duty, you are violating the investment policy statement. This is the violation. So other these two assess the expected returns and risk of potential portfolio investment. That's what the investment manager normally do. And choose among investments with similar risk and returns and characteristics to maximize the return on the portfolio. These are his normal jobs. So there is nothing wrong. There is no violation in B and C, but A is surely a violation. That makes A to be the correct option. Next, risk that may arise from ineffective corporate governance. Ineffective corporate governance, least likely to include. If there is ineffective corporate governance, there will be less effective decision making. When there is ineffective corporate governance, there would be weaker financial performance, lower margins, operating and gross margins. When there is ineffective corporate governance, there is increased default risk, increased, not reduced. Ineffective corporate governance would result in increased default risk. That is the least likely one. So that makes C to be the correct option. Next, the stakeholders of a company that prefer a relatively riskier company strategy that has the potential for superior company's performance are those. All these are stakeholders. Shareholders have interest, creditors and suppliers, they have the interest in business. So which of these stakeholders prefer a relatively riskier company strategy that has the potential for superior company performance. Shareholders, they are the one to gain. Taking a higher risk would mean higher expected returns. So among these three, shareholders are the stakeholders who will benefit from high risk because they will get more dividends, whereas the creditors get paid a fixed amount of interest. Suppliers, they prefer to be less risky. Creditors, they prefer to take less risk. So only the shareholders gain by engaging in high risk activities in order to maximize their return. So in this situation, shareholders are the stakeholders that prefer a relatively riskier company strategy so as to maximize their return. Normally, creditors and suppliers, they are risk averse. So that makes A to be the correct option. Next question. The interest of community groups affected by a company's operations are most likely to be considered in corporate governance under what? First of all, let us just make some concentric circles that will explain the layers of different types of stakeholders. The core are your shareholders. Outside, we might have some special interest groups. And then we have some community groups. All these are stakeholders. So the interest of community groups, what are special interest groups? Like trade unions. Trade unions are special interest groups. Shareholders are among the groups whose interests are considered under the shareholder theory. Resolving the conflict of interest of both shareholders and other stakeholders is the focus of corporate governance under the shareholder theory. So it means we are talking about a broader perspective, which includes your community groups as well. So the interest of community groups affected by the company's operations are most likely to be considered in corporate governance under the stakeholder theory. So that makes B to be the correct option. Next, the stakeholder group that typically prefers the greatest amount of business risk. We have already agreed, shareholders. They are the one to gain from high risk, high returns. They are the one who will benefit from high returns in the form of higher dividends, higher increase in share prices. Whereas the senior managers and directors, they are just the agents. They have to protect their jobs. So they can't take excessive risk. That will put them in trouble. So shareholders are the stakeholders group that typically prefers the greatest amount of business risk. That makes B to be the correct option. Next, which of the following stakeholders are most likely to benefit from company's growth and excellent financial performance? Customers, no. Customer, they're just looking for stability of ongoing operations and stability of relationship with the company. They just need to get paid on time. So they do not get benefit from the growth and excellent financial performance. They don't get share in profits. Incorrect. Creditors. Creditors do not receive extra returns in case company make better performance. They just need to be paid on time. They need to be paid their interest on time. Government, yes. When a company or a business grows, shows excellent performance, it will result in higher tax revenue for the government. For the economy as a whole, GDP would increase. Overall in the economy, the level of employment would increase. So this is the government that benefits from the company's growth and excellent financial performance. C is the result. Next, a company's internal system and practices. Before doing this question, let me just give you an overview. Stakeholders, management components. Stakeholders, management components. First is legal infrastructure, contractual infrastructure, organizational infrastructure, and governmental infrastructure. When you say legal infrastructure, that's the laws that govern the operations of the business. Contractual infrastructure, Contractual infrastructure is the arrangement between firm and its stakeholders under the contracts. Organizational infrastructure are internal systems and governance practices in an organization. And governmental infrastructure, these are the government regulation that have been imposed upon the organization. So legal infrastructure, laws; contractual infrastructure, arrangements between the firm, organization and its stakeholders; organizational infrastructure, internal systems and governance practices; and governmental infrastructure means regulations by the government imposed upon the firm or organization. These are the 4 types of infrastructure and the stakeholder management components. Company internal systems and practices for managing stakeholder relationship are most accurately described as organizational structure. Contractual structure are arrangements between the organization and its stakeholders. And governance structure, it's a collection of technologies, systems, people, policies, practices, and the relationship that interact to support governance activities. So it's a collection of overall systems, people, policies, practices within an organization. So that makes A to be the correct option. In the context of stakeholders management, organizational infrastructure is most accurately described as what? Contractual arrangement a company enters into with its stakeholders is contractual infrastructure. We just discussed a little while earlier. A company's internal procedures for addressing stakeholders' relationship. Yes, this is organizational infrastructure we discussed in the previous question. A framework for defining the rights and responsibilities of stakeholders. It is governance infrastructure. So remember, practices and governance procedures that a company adopts to manage its stakeholders' relationships, it is organizational infrastructure. That makes B to be the correct option. The stakeholders most likely to be concerned with their legal liabilities. Directors, creditors, and regulators. Creditors and regulators, they do not face any litigation issue for their actions. So they don't face any significant legal liabilities for their actions, whereas directors, since they are the agents of the shareholders, directors are legally responsible for their decisions and actions as board members. So that is the correct option, A. Next, minority shareholder groups. Minority shareholders group, also called the non-controlling interest. Let's say if this is the overall structure of the company, where 70% holding is maintained by certain interest groups and 30% by non-controlling interest or minority shareholders group. So minority shareholder groups are most likely to have influence over the corporate strategy when the board of directors election use cumulative voting. What is cumulative voting basically? Cumulative voting means each shareholder is entitled to 1 vote per share multiplied by the number of directors to be elected. Let's say if there are 10 directors to be elected and the shareholder holds, let's say 1,000 shares, it means 1,000 times 10, he will have 10,000 shares. He can use all these shares for selecting a single director. So this process, sometimes known as proportional voting, cumulative voting, is advantageous for individual investors because they can apply all of their votes to one candidate. Otherwise, they won't be heard. They will remain unheard. So minority shareholder groups are most likely to have influence over the corporate strategy when board elections use cumulative voting. 1 share multiplied by the number of directors to be elected. A person having just 1,000 shares will have 10,000 votes, and he can use all these votes to elect a single candidate. So they will have their voices heard then. It says board elections are staggered. Staggered board elections mean that the composition of board of directors cannot be changed for a certain number of years. Staggered board election limits the ability of the shareholders to select an entirely new board for some period of time. This is one of the defensive strategy for takeover. We'll discuss later. So using majority voting means then most of the directors will be appointed by the 70% shareholding. So we want to give the power to the minority shareholders, so then they can have their representation on the board. So this is how they will do. With cumulative voting, minority shareholders are more likely to gain seats. They can use their votings, cumulative voting, for just a couple of directors. So that makes A to be the correct option, and 8 is next. The stakeholder theory of corporate governance is primarily focused on what? Resolving the competing interest. We discussed this a little while earlier. This is the correct option. Resolving the competing interest of those who manage companies and other groups affected by companies' decisions or actions. We have done this in detail. This is the stakeholders theory. Increasing the value of company. This is the shareholders theory. The focus is only on shareholders. Not the right option. The interest of various stakeholders rather than the interest of shareholders. There is no such theory. Ultimately, shareholders are most important than all the rest of the stakeholders. So focusing on other stakeholders and not the shareholders, that totally makes this option to be incorrect. Next, thematic investing is most accurately described as what? Thematic means selecting a specific investment having some specific social factor or environmental factor. So let us read the options one by one. Thematic investing is most accurately described as excluding companies or sectors from consideration for investment based on environmental and social factors. This is called a negative screening. Kicking such investments out, rejecting such investment, negative screening. Thematic investing is most accurately described as considering a single environmental or social factor when selecting investments. That's what I just told you. Thematic investing refers to selecting investments with a view to a specific environment, social or governance factor. This is called thematic investing. Identifying the best companies in each sector with respect to environmental and social factors. This is called best-in-class investing. Identifying the best companies in each sector with respect to environmental and social factors, it is referred to as the best-in-class investing. So we were looking for thematic investing. That makes B to be the correct option, and B it is. Next, which of the following environmental factors is least likely to arise from inadequate internal controls and safety standards? Low-cost resource depletion. This is something manageable through adequate internal controls. We were looking for an environmental factor that is least likely to arise from inadequate internal controls and safety standards. This is to some extent manageable through conservation. Waste contamination is manageable through green technologies. But stranded assets. What is a stranded asset? 100 years ago, there was no electricity, about 150 years ago. So people used to, for lighting purpose, they used lamps. After the advent of electricity, lamps is history. Now the unneeded stock of lamps after electricity, they are not needed. They are the stranded assets. Typewriters, stranded assets, right? Unneeded lamps, unneeded typewriters, those assets that have lost their utility are stranded assets. They are no longer used. The assets that have become uneconomic because of change in regulations or change in technology, they are no longer used. Stranded assets. Next, environmental, social and governance investing, ESG, is most accurately described as what? Excluding companies in carbon production based industries from consideration for investment. This is called negative screening. Rejecting such companies that result in some carbon production, means environmentally damaging gases or releasing some toxic material into the air, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. Excluding such companies, it is called negative screening. Negative screening. ESG investing is most accurately described as integrating environmental and social considerations into investment decision-making process. This is the correct option. Investing only in companies that promote environmental and social initiatives favored by an investor. It is best described as impact investment or impact investing. So that makes B to be our correct option, and as you can see, B it is. Next, which of the following statements about corporate governance is most accurate? Corporate governance may be focused only on shareholders' interest. Could be. Corporate governance best practices are essentially the same in developed economies. Now, this is questionable. Corporate governance practices and definitions, they vary greatly, significantly across countries. Is defined in the same way? No. Even definitions of corporate governance are different across various countries. Yes, corporate governance may be focused on shareholders' interest, because under the shareholder theory of corporate governance, practices are primarily those that support shareholders' interest. While we have a competing theory called stakeholder theory, under the stakeholder theory of corporate governance, the interest of various affected groups are considered and balanced. So that makes A to be the correct option. A it is. Shareholders who use their shares voting power or other means to pressure company to make changes they believe will increase shareholders' value are most accurately described as activists. The word activist will just help you select the right option. Activist shareholders, proactive, taking the action from the front line. ESG shareholders, they are concerned with ESG issues, environmental, social, and governance issues. Proxy shareholders. Proxy shareholder is basically an individual with the legal authorization called the power of attorney, a legal authorization to vote on behalf of a company shareholder. What does it mean? For example, a person A, through legal authorization, through power of attorney, he can use the shareholding of X, Y, Z during an annual general meeting. So this A person is called the shareholder proxy. He is an individual with the legal authorization, power of attorney, to vote on behalf of X, Y, and Z of company shareholding during an annual general meeting or annual meeting, right? So of course not the answer in the given scenario. That makes A to be the correct option. Next, in principal agent relationship most likely exists between companies, shareholders, and managers. They are the principals, they are the agents. We discussed this a little while earlier. So that makes A to be the correct option. To judge whether management's incentives are aligned with the firm's stated goals, an analyst should examine firm's what? Management incentives. Where do you find management incentives? Management incentives are through remuneration programs. Disclosures of firms' remuneration programs enable an analyst to judge whether this compensation structure aligns management incentives with the firm's objective in order to promote goal congruence. Right? So this is where he should look at. Share class structure will show you different types of shares issued by the same issuer. Cross-holding means a company A, a listed company, holds some stock in company B, another listed company. Of course not. A, B are irrelevant, so that makes C to be your correct option, and C it is. Smith Company's board of directors assign responsibilities to 3 committees. The committee that is most likely to be responsible for establishing the chief executive's compensation package is Remuneration Committee and Nomination Committee. This is their role. Remuneration Committee is responsible for handling the contracts and performances of managers and directors. Audit and Governance Committee. Audit Committee, it oversees the selection of external auditors, the CPA firm. It is involved in recommending the appointment of Chief Audit Executive, the Head of Internal Audit Department, and they are the one who propose the auditor's remuneration, and external and internal auditors report to the audit committee. So they have very important role in audit and assurance services. Governance committee. This committee ensures organization adopts good governance practices. It reviews policies on regular basis. It monitors organizations' compliance with the applicable laws and regulations. Then we have investment committee. Investment committee is responsible for reviewing material investment opportunities, large projects, acquisitions, expansion, etc. And the risk committee, this is the committee specifically designated to assist the board in determining the risky policies. It oversees enterprise risk management implementation, ERM, which you have studied in your section D, CMA part 2. And that's all. Corporate governance is over.